Whether you're religious or not, I recommend reading the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. Get a copy and listen to this pod. Without further ado, let's get into it. It may be replied that some meddlesome human writers, notably Boethius, have let this secret out. But in the intellectual climate which we have at last succeeded in producing throughout Western Europe, you needn't bother about that. Only the learned read all books, and we have now so dealt with the learned that they are of all men the least likely to acquire wisdom by doing so. We have done this by inculcating the historical point of view. The historical point of view, put briefly, means that when a learned man is presented with any statement in an ancient author, the one question he never asks is whether it is true. He asks who influenced the ancient writer, and how far the statement is consistent with what he said in other books, and what phase in the writer's development or in the general history of thought it illustrates, and how it affected later writers, and how often it has been misunderstood, especially by the learned man's own colleagues, and what the general course of criticism on it has been for the last 10 years, and what is the present state of the question. To regard the ancient writer as a possible source of knowledge, to anticipate that what he said could possibly modify your thoughts or of your behavior, this would be rejected as unutterable simple-minded. And since we cannot deceive the whole human race all the time, it is important thus to cut every generation off from all others. For where learning makes a free commerce between the ages, there is always the danger that the characteristic errors of one may be corrected by the characteristic truths of another. But thanks be to our Father and the historical point of view, great scholars are now as little nourished by the past as the most ignorant mechanics who hold that history is bunk. This is an excerpt from Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. So before we get into the excerpt, a brief background on Lewis. Lewis is a philosopher theologian. He was a professor of medieval and Renaissance English. You probably know him from his very famous work, the Narnian series. And I grew up with the Narnian series. It was read to me as a child. I came across Screwtape Letters about 15 or so years ago. When I first read Screwtape Letters, it blew my mind because it was so accurate in how your mind works. And you'll realize when you read the Screwtape Letters that Lewis has a very good understanding of human psychology. Only somebody with a grasp on how the mind works can write in such an eloquent way as to express the advice that Screwtape gives to his nephew. So what is Screwtape Letters about? Screwtape Letters is a series of letters from Screwtape, who is an experienced devil, giving advice to his nephew, Wormwood. Wormwood is an inexperienced demon tasked with the mission of tempting a man who in the letters is only known as the patient, because the man has recently converted to Christianity and is attending church. It's a fascinating book because it takes the perspective of a devil, of an experienced devil, Screwtape, giving advice on how to tempt human beings, how to deceive them, how to win their souls from the good. And so there's a lot of exploration of different temptation ploys that Screwtape gives to Wormwood to use. Generally, it's also a very funny book when Screwtape criticizes Wormwood for failing to tempt the patient properly. Lewis, when he was writing Screwtape Letters, did not enjoy the process at all. He said it was dry and gritty. He just did not feel good writing this book. And it reminded me of Heath Ledger and some of the other actors who've played very dark roles in movies, where when they try to get into the character, or I should say when they actually get into the character, end up embodying that character fully, it almost has this effect on them. It sort of corrupts them, corrupts their mind, such that people around these actors feel there's a sort of bad aura around them. And obviously with Heath Ledger, unfortunately, not necessarily because of the role that he played as Joker, but soon after he played the role as Joker, he ended his life. And so when I learned that Lewis had a similar experience of getting into the mind of how the devil works and how the devil might try to tempt people to do things that they know aren't good for them, that was very interesting. Now, one thing to note here is Lewis is obviously a Christian, but I recommend people who aren't religious read the Screwtape Letters, because it will provide an insight into how your mind works. And we've talked about the importance of overcoming your lower man. And you can take the perspective when you're reading it, if you're not religious, to understand that Screwtape and Wormwood's position as that of the lower man, who is the uncontrolled man filled with passions and desires that the higher man must overcome. So jumping into the excerpt that we read, Screwtape says, "Only the learned read old books, and we have now so dealt with the learned that they are of all men the least likely to acquire wisdom by doing so." And then he goes on to say, the reason that is the case is when they read, they never ask whether what they're reading is true, but always come from the historical perspective of what influenced this writer, who ended up being influenced, and so on and so forth. The learned, the scholars, the academics, and many of us fit into this category of simply reading for the sake of collecting facts. And the point that Screwtape is making is this is what helps us win the battles of getting people over onto our side, because when they read things, they never ask themselves whether it's true, whether it's metaphysically, whether it's epistemologically true. And as such, you can have scholars, bright scholars, who at the end of the day don't have wisdom. The reason you and I read ancient books is not simply to acquire facts, but it's to ask ourselves, what is it that we can learn from these books? What is it that we can take from these sages who've walked life before us, hundreds, 500, thousands of years before us, and implement their wisdom into our life? And so you and I are doing exactly what Screwtape doesn't want humans to do. Related to this is this idea of knowledge without action is dead. And for Screwtape and Wormwood, that is their goal, is to get people to acquire knowledge but have no action related to it. There's no correlating action to it. And so I quote Screwtape, "You," meaning referring to Wormwood, "you must bring him," the patient, "to a condition in which he can practice self-examination for an hour without discovering any of those facts about himself which are perfectly clear to anyone who has ever lived in the same house with him or worked in the same office." Essentially, get somebody to practice meditation, get somebody to be self-reflective, to write things down for extended periods of time without actually discovering anything about himself that needs to be worked on. Let him practice meditation, let him practice reflection in a way that is actually detached from his day-to-day experience. And a quick note here is the patient in Screwtape Letters, he's taking care of his mother who's sick. And so we'll see how that plays a role into this idea of knowledge without action. So this is from the first letter from Screwtape to Wormwood. "My dear Wormwood, I note what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a great deal of his materialist friend. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not. And if it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing and were prepared to alter their way of life as the result of a chain of reasoning. But what with that weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Your man has been accustomed ever since he was a boy to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't waste time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think it is strong or stark or courageous, that it is the philosophy of the future. That's the sort of thing we care about." Screwtape is criticizing Wormwood because he was relying on arguments to convince the patient, when instead Screwtape says, look, arguments would have worked centuries ago, but now we're living in an age where arguments play no role, and the important thing is jargon. Because back a few centuries ago, if an argument was shown to be true, then people actually followed this through and changed their minds and changed their lives as a result of this. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that because we are talking about human beings here. Human beings, for the most part, are never convinced by arguments. As much as we like to think that we are rational and that we change our minds because we are able to follow a line of thought, that is not the case. Sometimes that will be the case, but for the most part, we are very good at retrospective justification. We cling onto a belief, whether we change our mind as a result of some emotion, some experience that we have, and then we retrospectively justify that belief. And that is the case for almost all of our beliefs. Lewis here is knowingly being naive in the way he writes to emphasize the point that we live in an age where action and knowledge are separate. And more importantly, our culture places a very strong emphasis on knowledge. The more knowledge that you have, the more scholarly you are, somehow the more you're considered better than those who don't have that knowledge. The prime example being the very strong distinction we have between white-collar work and blue-collar work. Unfortunately, many white-collar workers look down on blue-collar workers as if they're the blue-collar workers, that their work is beneath the white-collar, when in fact the blue-collar workers whose work makes the society function day to day. When there's a big snowstorm and the power lines are cut, without electricians, we wouldn't have modern cities. And so in one sense, blue-collar workers are more important than white-collar workers. But we, in our world, have reversed this. We place a very strong emphasis on going to college, getting degrees, when in fact, colleges and degrees don't equal wisdom. They don't equal learning. Oftentimes, they are the prime candidate for indoctrination. And Screwtape understands this and now is teaching this to his nephew. And so he says, the great thing is to prevent his doing anything. As long as he does not convert it into action, it does not matter how much he thinks about his new repentance. Let the little brute wallow in it. Let him, if he has any bent that way, write a book about it. That is often an excellent way of sterilizing the seeds which the enemy plants in a human soul. Let him do anything but act. No amount of piety in his imagination and affections will harm us if we can keep it out of his will. As one of the humans has said, active habits are strengthened by repetition, but passive ones are weakened. The more often he feels without acting, the less he will be able ever to act, and in the long run, the less he will be able to feel. I love that quote. No amount of piety in his imagination and affection will harm us if we can keep it out of his will. And that's because the moment you infuse your will into the piety, into the thing that you've learned, you're going to start changing the way you live. You're going to start changing the way you think, the way you treat others. Hence why Screwtape says, let him do anything but act. And then elsewhere, Screwtape says, as this condition becomes more fully established, you will be gradually freed from the tiresome business of providing pleasures as temptations, as the uneasiness and his reluctance to face it cut him off more and more from all real happiness, and as habit renders the pleasures of vanity and excitement and flippancy at once all pleasant and harder to forego. For that is what habit fortunately does to a pleasure. You will find that anything or nothing is sufficient to attract his wandering attention. You no longer need a good book, which he really likes, to keep him from his prayers or his work or his sleep. A column of advertisements in yesterday's paper will do. You can make him waste his time, not only in conversation he enjoys with people whom he likes, but in conversations with those he cares nothing about on subjects that bore him. You can make him do nothing at all for long periods. You can keep him up late at night, not roistering but staring at a dead fire in a cold room. All the healthy and outgoing activities which we want him to avoid can be inhibited and nothing given in return, so that at least he may say, as one of my own patients said on his arrival down here, I now see that I spent most of my life in doing neither what I ought nor what I liked. The Christians describe the enemy as one without whom nothing is strong, and nothing is very strong. Strong enough to steal away a man's best year, not in sweet sins, but in a dreary flickering of the mind over it knows not what and knows not why, in the gratification of the curiosities so feeble that the man is only half aware of them, in drumming of fingers and kicking of heels, in whistling tunes that he does not like, or in the long, dim labyrinth of reveries that have not even lust or ambition to give them a relish, but which, once chance association has started them, the creature is too weak and fuddled to shake off. Screwtape is saying, get people to live in a world where they are not doing anything, where they are living lives of misery, not miseries because they are suffering, but miseries because they are not doing anything, where they spend periods of their time doing absolutely nothing. Again, I'm quoting this. Nothing is very strong enough to steal away a man's best years. Not in sweet sins, but in a dreary flickering of the mind over it knows not what and knows not why. And then quoting from the same section, you can make him waste his time, not only in conversation he enjoys with people whom he likes, but in conversation with those he cares nothing about on subjects that bore him. Later we'll talk about the hypocrisy and why Screwtape tells Wormwood to keep the patient's mind preoccupied with impressing people, impressing his girlfriends, friends, and the family. And it's a reminder for us to ask ourselves, what are things that we are doing that are not good for us, but also things that we don't enjoy, not because it's not fun, but because we're doing things simply to impress other people, to get the praises of others. It's important to not give your mind over to somebody else's control. As Epictetus says, and I'm paraphrasing him here, if you found out that somebody was controlling your body, you would be offended and you would be furious. But how often do you give your mind over to the control of other people? And this is important because when you give your mind over to other people, you're no longer living a life on your own terms. You're living somebody else's life to impress somebody else, whether that's your parents, whether that's your friends, whether that's your boss, whether that's some woman or man that you're going on dates with. And if you're not careful, you will continue to repeat this pattern over and over again until you realize right at the end, as one of Screwtape's patients says, I now see that I spent most of my life in doing neither what I ought nor what I liked. And at one point, Screwtape talks about the patient's mother and how, the patient is praying for his mother and Wormwood is, concerned about the prayer. So the advice that Screwtape gives is this. It is no doubt impossible to prevent his praying for his mother, but we have means of rendering the prayers innocuous. Make sure that they are always very spiritual, that he is always concerned with the state of her soul and never with her rheumatism. Reminds me of the book of James in the Bible, which can be summarized by the verse, so also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. There is no greater scam in our modern world than believing that all you need is right beliefs and knowledge, whether in religion, in philosophy, or in politics, and to an extent science. Right beliefs and right doctrines don't mean anything if your life is no different. And if you remember from the Tolstoy episode, which is episode number 2, one of the reasons that Tolstoy ends up leaving the Orthodox Church is because he sees in the clergy the hypocrisy that they are living in. And this is also what the Buddha in the Dhammapada, another episode that we did, when he says that a merchant who lives a life of virtue, even if it's simply for a day and dies, he says, is more of a Brahmin, a holy man, than a monk who dons the yellow robe but never lives a life of virtue. So understand that simply because you have knowledge about a particular field, a particular religion, philosophy, politics, or science, doesn't make it the case that you have wisdom. Because when you have wisdom, your life changes accordingly. Hence, Screwtape says, you can make the patient's prayer innocuous by emphasizing that the prayers are very spiritual, very ethereal, very abstract, and never concerned with the present need of his mother, never about attending to her pains, like her physical ailments. And on that note, Screwtape says, in civilized life, domestic hatred usually expresses itself by saying things which would appear quite harmless on paper. The words are not offensive, but in such a choice or at such a moment that they are not far short of a blow in the face. To keep this game up, you and Glubos, who is another devil assigned to the patient's mother, to keep this game up, you and Glubos must see to it that each of these fools has a sort of double standard. Your patient must demand that all of his own utterances are to be taken at their face value and judged simply on the actual words, while at the same time judging all his mother's utterances with the fullest and most oversensitive interpretation of the tone and the context and the suspected intention. So we're getting to this theme of making sure that the patient continues to live a hypocritical life, that the patient is very gracious and forgiving of what he says and what he does, but very unforgiving and harsh towards other people. C.S. Lewis understands us. This is what you and I do in our life. We tend to be more gracious to ourselves, our mistakes, than towards somebody else's. And that's why Jesus has that famous quote in Matthew 7, when he says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." And there's a great section when, after the patient has converted, Wormwood is concerned that the patient is going to church frequently. And so Screwtape says, listen, going to church is good for us. We can actually use it to our advantage. And the advice he gives is quite on point. And I quote, "Your patient, thanks to our Father below, is a fool, provided that any of those neighbors sing out of tune or have boots that squeak or double chins or odd clothes. The patient will quite easily believe that their religion must therefore be somehow ridiculous." Meaning, let it be the case that we convince the patient somehow that everything within the church should be perfect, including the people who are there. And make it the case that he becomes very critical of everybody else's life, how they're dressed, how they look, what they do in their day-to-day life, but never be reflective of himself. Never be so self-reflective that he sees his own faults. Tying back to that quote when Screwtape says, "You must bring him to a condition in which he can practice self-examination for an hour without discovering any of those facts about himself which are perfectly clear to anyone who has ever lived in the same house with him or worked in the same office." And as Krishnamurti said, this is the previous episode we did, if you do not love your neighbor and if you do not love the world, but you claim to practice meditation for hours on end, Krishnamurti says, you've then misunderstood what it means to meditate. Which takes us to this idea of hypocrisy that Screwtape wants Wormwood to push and encourage. And I quote, "Do what you will, there is going to be some benevolence as well as some malice in your patient's soul. The great thing is to direct the malice to his immediate neighbors whom he meets every day and to thrust his benevolence out to the remote circumferences to people he does not know." So at this point, Wormwood is concerned that war is happening or is going to happen, and he doesn't know what to do because the patient is getting concerned about this war, where Screwtape realizes that this is another opportunity for us devils to use this to our advantage. And the way we do this is by making the patient feel benevolent for the people who are suffering very far away from him, but never caring about the people right next to him, never caring about the person sitting next to him in the church. Lewis could have been writing for our day and age. It's so common for people to care about some war that's happening thousands of miles away, but never caring about the stranger, the people on the streets with no home, the drug addicts on the streets, right? Never caring for them, never taking care of them, never going out and helping them, but somehow being deeply affected by some rumors of wars thousands and thousands of miles away from us. And for Screwtape, that is the way to poison people's mind. And the reason we do this, where we abstract away the people next to us, but somehow materialize the people who are far from us, and it's because of a sense of superiority and elitism that we have, which Screwtape addresses to Wormwood when he says, and he's talking about how the patient has found new friends. Sooner or later, however, the real nature of his new friends must become clear to him, and then your tactics must depend on the patient's intelligence. If he is a big enough fool, you can get him to realize the character of the friends only while they are absent. Their presence can be made to sweep away all criticism. If this succeeds, he can be induced to live, as I have known many humans to live for quite long periods, two parallel lives. He will not only appear to be, but actually be a different man in each of the circles he frequents. Failing this, there is a subtler and more entertaining method. He can be made to take a positive pleasure in the perception that the two sides of his life are inconsistent. This is done by exploiting his vanity. He can be taught to enjoy kneeling beside the grocer on Sunday just because he remembers that the grocer could not possibly understand the urbane and mocking world which he inhabits on Saturday evening, and contrariwise to enjoy the body and blasphemy over the coffee with these admirable friends, all the more because he is aware of a deeper spiritual world within which they cannot understand. You see the idea? The worldly friends can touch him on one side and the grocer on the other, and he is complete, balanced, complex man who sees around them. Thus, while being permanently treacherous to at least two sets of people, he will feel, instead of shame, a continual undercurrent of self-satisfaction. How often do we do this? Where you get pleasure in the fact that you feel superior to somebody else because they don't know the secrets. They don't know the doctrines as well as you know. They don't know philosophies as well as you do. But at the same time, you feel pride in your humility to be able to interact with people who don't have these knowledge. Right? This is what Screwtape is getting at. He's saying to Wormwood, play on their vanity. Because again, you and I live in a world of vanity. Vanity is praised. Screwtape writes a letter to Wormwood when he finds out who the devil assigned to the girlfriend is. So he writes, "My dear Wormwood, I've been in correspondence with Slum Trimpet, who is in charge of your patient's young woman, and begin to see the chink in her armor. It is an unobtrusive little vice which she shares with nearly all women who have grown up in an intelligent circle united by a clearly defined belief, and it consists in a quite untroubled assumption that the outsiders who do not share this belief are really too stupid and ridiculous. The males who habitually meet these outsiders do not feel that way. Their confidence, if they are confident, is of a different kind. Hers, which she supposes to be due to faith, is in reality largely due to the mere color she has taken from her surroundings. It is not, in fact, very different from the conviction she would have felt at the age of 10 that the kind of fish knives used in her father's house were the proper or normal or real kind, while those of the neighboring families were not real fish knives at all. Now, the element of ignorance and naivete in all this is so large, and the element of spiritual pride so small, that it gives us little hope of the girl herself. But have you thought of how it can be made to influence your patient?" Again, emphasizing the point that this sense of elitism can be found in almost any aspect of our life. The patient's girlfriend here is prideful because she feels that the beliefs that she has are the right ones. And so anybody who doesn't share these beliefs are in the wrong. And that sense of separation between us and them is what gives her a sense of belonging and a sense of pride. And this sense of us and them seems to be embedded in human nature. You know, the episode we did with Sebastian Junger, his point was tribes are very important. And the one aspect of our tribes that is obvious is this idea of our tribe versus their tribe, us versus them. And having this tribalistic thinking can play certain roles in your level of satisfaction and purposefulness in life. However, the warning from C.S. Lewis and also from Krishnamurti is when you make this distinction between you and them, you and the other, when you make that distinction between you and them by making yourself human and the other person the devil, or by making the other person an animal, that is when the worst crimes are committed. That is when humans are willing to commit whatever crimes and whatever disgusting act simply to keep that distinction alive. How does that make sense if you're religious and the religion preaches love is the most important thing? How can you make that distinction so stark and make it the case that you become the elite, you become the known, you become the ones with the knowledge, and everybody else is in the dark? And this leads us into this idea of transactional relationships. And currently, the idea of transactional relationships, I think, is the norm for the most part, right? The idea of networking. There's a saying that your network is your net worth. This sort of maxim places and embeds within the psyche that your friendships are all transactional. That the goal in life is to acquire friends and to trade friends so that you can move up in the world, to help you build your status. Some people will not be friends with certain types of people because they think that that person is below them, right? That person does not have the right belief. That person is not going to take them to the place that they want to go. Even if that potential person has some of the best moral standing, certain people will not want to engage in them because they do work that is beneath the white collar man. And this is why I say, even if you're not religious, you should read the Screwtape Letters. Because wherever this idea of elitism, when Screwtape is obviously talking to Wormwood within this context of Christianity, it is applicable outside of it, because the world we live in have connecting themes across religions, philosophies, politics. So Screwtape has this quote: "You should always try to make the patient abandon the people or food or books he really likes in favor of the best people, the right food, the important books." If you're friends with people simply because they have some sort of transactional value, they are not your friends. And if somebody's friends with you for that, you will soon find out that you don't actually have friends. You know when you have friends, and you know you have good friends, friendships that go beyond material benefits, when one of you suffers. Suffering and pain or tragedy in your life will reveal to you who your friends are. And I've learned this the hard way. I lost friends I thought were good friends I thought would last me a lifetime, all disappeared when I was suffering. And as sad as I was when that happened, it taught me an important lesson about friendships. A good friend will always help you become a better man or better woman. If they're not doing that, it's not that they're not your friends, but they're never going to be your good friend. Moving on to this interesting point about humans as amphibians. Screwtape says, "Humans are amphibians, half spirit, half animal. The enemy's determination to produce such a revolting hybrid was one of the things that determined our Father to withdraw his support from him. As spirits, they belong to the eternal world, but as animals, they inhabit time. This means that while their spirit can be directed to an eternal object, their bodies, passions, and imaginations are in continual change. For to be in time means to change. Their nearest approach to constancy, therefore, is undulation, the repeated return to a level from which they repeatedly fall back, a series of troughs and peaks. If you had watched your patient carefully, you would have seen the undulation in every department of his life. His interest in his work, his affection for his friends, his physical appetite, all go up and down. As long as he lives on earth, periods of emotional and bodily richness and liveliness will alter with periods of numbness and poverty. The dryness and dullness through which your patient is now going are not, as you fondly suppose, your workmanship. They are merely a natural phenomenon which will do us no good unless you make good use of it." This idea as human beings, as amphibians, right, half spirit, half animal, nothing new that Lewis is saying, right? This is sort of common across all the sages and philosophers that we've studied so far. This idea of belonging to an eternal world, but also inhabiting time, is, I think, accurate because human beings have a longing for the infinite in the way we act, in the things that we do, whether you actually believe in the infinite, whether you actually believe in a world beyond this. The way human nature is such that it's sort of embedded in what we do. That's why people care about legacy. If it wasn't there, if it wasn't built into the nature of humans, nobody would care about legacy. Nobody would care about having their life's work impact the world beyond them, beyond their present time frame. Screwtape earlier in one of the letters actually says, "For they, humans, constantly forget what you must always remember, that they are animals and that whatever their bodies do affect their souls." So tying back to this idea of living action-oriented lives, simply not living a life where you're acquiring knowledge without any action. Your action has a cyclical effect on you. Your habits have an effect on your character. That's why Screwtape says, they constantly forget that they're animals and forget that their actions or their bodies, what they do with them, affect their soul. And so you and I know this. Hence, it's important to act with the knowledge that we have by taking the small step in the beginning. Could potentially have a strong impact or a large impact on your life. You simply don't know it yet. So Screwtape says, "The humans live in time, but our enemy destines them to eternity. He therefore, I believe, wants them to attend chiefly to two things, to eternity itself and to that point of time which they call the present. For the present is the point at which time touches eternity. Of the present moment and of it only, humans have an experience analogous to the experience which our enemy has of reality as a whole. In it alone, freedom and actuality are offered to them. He would therefore have them continually concerned either with eternity, which means being concerned with him, or with the present, either meditating on the eternal union with or separation from himself, or else obeying the present voice of conscience, bearing the present cross, receiving the present grace, giving thanks to the present pleasure. As I'm reading this, having just done that episode on Krishnamurti, Krishnamurti's words and message was very prominent in my mind. And the point that Krishnamurti makes is quite simple. And it is that the present moment is all that there is. And so to live in the present moment, according to Krishnamurti, is to live in it without the baggage of the past and without the pull and tug of the future. And we'll get there in just a bit with Lewis when Screwtape says the same thing. Screwtape's point is human beings, because they are amphibians, half spirit, half animal, they are pulled both to eternity and in the present. And they always exist in these two realms. When they're not focused on eternity, the closest thing to eternity then is that present moment, right? When he says, present is the point at which time touches eternity. And Krishnamurti makes a very similar point. And same with Eckhart Tolle, which is another episode that we've done. When you can exist in this moment without any baggage, without any tug, then it is in that moment that you will experience the fullness of life. Right? That's what we call, another episode we've done with Csikszentmihalyi, the presence of flow is what happens. This obviously becomes important when you're meditating, when you're praying. If you're distracted by the past, by the future, then you're not really there. And there's a term that Screwtape used called the Unbounded Now, which I really liked, right? The unbounded now being the present, where eternity touches time. And Screwtape gets mad at Wormwood because Wormwood allows the patient to be present. So he says this, and now for your blunders. On your own showing, you first of all allowed the patient to read a book he really enjoyed because he enjoyed it and not in order to make clever remarks about it to his new friends. In the second place, you allowed him to walk down to the old mill and have tea there, a walk through country he really likes and taken alone. In other words, you allowed him two real positive pleasures. Were you so ignorant as not to see the danger of this? The characteristic of pains and pleasure is that they are unmistakably real, and therefore, as far as they go, give the man who feels them a touchstone of reality. So because Wormwood allowed the patient to enjoy these little things but be fully present in it, it starts to take his mind more and more to the present, and as a result, the amphibianness comes alive, right? Where eternity and the present meet. So later on, Screwtape says, our business is to get them away from the eternal and from the present. With this in mind, we sometimes tempt a human, say a widow or a scholar, to live in the past. It is far better to make them live in the future. Biological necessity makes all their passions point in that direction already, so that thought about the future inflames hope and fear. In a word, the future is, of all things, the thing least like eternity. It is the most completely temporal part of time, for the past is frozen and no longer flows, and the present is all lit up with eternal rays. The more I study these books, the more consistent themes that come up, a thread that goes through all these books. And it doesn't even matter if they're all from different traditions, different philosophies. There's this thread. The fact that there is a connection, not even just a small connection, between what Lewis is saying about time, about the present, about eternity, with Krishnamurti, who, for the most part, I would venture to say, not many Christians would have heard about Krishnamurti or have read his work. But the fact that there is a similarity between Krishnamurti's work and Lewis's work, and specifically Lewis pretending to be Screwtape, who is trying to tempt the young Christian convert away from his faith through the advice that he's giving to his nephew, is incredible to me. And to be honest, I shouldn't be shocked at this, but I am consistently awed when I'm reading books and there's just an undeniable, consistent, universal wisdom at play. And here, Screwtape is talking about another devil called Glubos, who's been working on a woman, an old woman. And this old woman, her vice is gluttony, but not gluttony of food, but gluttony of delicacy. She loves everything to be proper, so proper, and I quote, the real value of the quiet, unobtrusive work which Glubos has been doing for years on this old woman can be gauged by the way in which her belly now dominates her whole life. The woman is in what may be called the all I want state of mind. All she wants is a cup of tea properly made, or an egg properly boiled, or a slice of bread properly toasted. But she never finds any servant or any friend who can do these simple things properly, because her properly conceals an insatiable demand for the exact and almost impossible palatable pleasures which she imagines she remembers from the past, a past described by her as the days when you could get good servants, but known to us as the days when her senses were more easily pleased and she had pleasures of other kinds which made her less dependent on those of the table. And this section, when he says, palatable pleasures which she imagines she remembers from the past, a past described by her as the days when she could get good servants. It's a reminder for us to not live our lives dependent on what has happened in the past. And that means to not bring the traumas, the failings from the past and to corrupt the present moment. Because when we do that, right, when we bring the traumas from the past, what Krishnamurti, for example, ends up saying is, if that's the case, the person experiencing the present moment is actually not you. It's yourself from the past. And if it's yourself from the past, then it's not you. Because you, if you want to experience this moment, you have to be here fully. And for you to be here fully, your past self cannot be here. And neither can your future self be. It can only be your present self. So moving on from this idea of unbounded now and the present to one section and theme that stood out to me was on cowardice. So Screwtape's advice on how to turn vices into twisted virtues is quite fascinating. So he says, mere cowardice is shameful. Like cowardice boasted of with humorous exaggerations and grotesque gestures can be passed off as funny. Cruelty is shameful unless the cruel man can represent it as a practical joke. The idea here is nobody wants to be known as a coward, but if you can boast of your cowardice and make it funny, then you can pass it off as humorous. And if it's humorous, people will enjoy it, and then all of a sudden your cowardice has become a strength. And this is what I mean by vices being twisted into virtues. Because in reality, they're still vices. It's just that they've become funny. But the difference is the people, instead of shaming you, instead of encouraging you to be courageous, people enjoy your cowardice because it's become a sort of play that you use. Same with cruelty. And so Screwtape goes on to say, near the end, but hatred is best combined with fear. Cowardice alone of all the vices is purely painful. Horrible to anticipate, horrible to feel, horrible to remember. Hatred has its pleasures. It is therefore often the compensation by which a frightened man reimburses himself for the miseries of fear. The more he fears, the more he will hate. And hatred is also a great anodyne for shame. To make a deep wound in his charity, you should therefore first defeat his courage. And Screwtape understands that courage is going to be the one virtue that will help you with all your other virtues. Without courage, you cannot develop any of your virtues. You cannot develop your character. And this reminded me of the quote by Lao Tzu when he says, a man with outward courage dares to die. A man with inward courage dares to live. What he means here is, if you have an outward courage, you are willing to go into battle because you will get praises. You will die a glorious death. Or you're willing to make a stand and say, I'm willing to die for this cause, so on and so forth. Where Lao Tzu says, a man with inward courage dares to live. What this means is that you take this life seriously, that you live in this present moment without the distraction of the past or the future. And if you die, you die, because a man with inward courage ultimately has outward courage to die. But a man with outward courage does not necessarily have the inward courage, because the inward courage requires that you are fully engaged in the moment, fully engaged in becoming a better man. And to do that, you need to live. You need to live without fear. So to boil it down, our challenge is to do that, to cultivate courage in the small things in our lives, to live in the present moment, to live in the unbounded now. And more practically, if there's something that you learned in this episode or later this week. Make sure you implement that in your life. And with that, I'll wrap. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you haven't already subscribed, do subscribe. It helps tremendously, and give this podcast a rating on Apple and on Spotify. It helps people find this pod. Until next week, peace.